Chapter 2. Be Our Guests. Both Gaston and his father looked smashing in what Gaston's father called their Sunday best. The other servants would still be in their uniforms, of course, which was rather fancy attire, all things considered. Being uniforms of servants in a royal household, and Gaston's father knew it wouldn't be appropriate to wear his outdoor clothing to dinner. So a little warning next time, okay? They were a handsome pair, and two of them entered the servants' hall together, both of them with their dark hair and blue eyes, and strong features. Gaston looked like a miniature version of his father, all except for the long scar that ran diagonally across his father's face. But that scar did nothing to diminish Grosvenor's good looks. It was almost as if it made him more handsome. And in Gaston's eyes, it most certainly made him seem strong and brave, and rather mysterious as well, since his father would never speak about how the scar came about. When Gaston and his father entered the servants' hall, everyone was making their way to their seats at the long wooden dining table in the center of the room. Mrs. Potts spotted Gaston's father right away and wrapped her arms around him tightly. Grosvenor laughed and squeezed her back heartily. Mrs. Potts looked tiny, wrapped in the huge man's arms, and everyone could see she had the sparkle of tears welling up in her eyes. So overjoyed, he accepted her invitation. "I'm so happy you've come, Grosvenor. It's been far too long since you've joined us for dinner. I never get to see you these days, but I do keep up on how you're doing from Gaston." "Of course," she said, smiling at the boy. "I hope he isn't bothering you, Mrs. Potts," he said, tussling Gaston's dark hair. "Are you kidding, Grosvenor?" Mrs. Potts dotes on the boy. It was Mr. Potts, patting his dear friend on the back and laughing. "This is like old times, seeing you here with us," he added, pulling out a chair for his friend to take a seat. "Gaston, why don't you go into the kitchen?" said Mrs. Potts. "I put together a hamper for you to take home after dinner. Go on and take a peek at the goodies Chef Bouge and I packed for you and your papa, while we grown-ups catch up." Gaston's father watched as his son ran off to the kitchen excitedly. It made him smile to see Gaston so happy, to be so at home among the other servants. There had been a time when he felt the same, and it felt good to be with them again. He wasn't sure why he had waited so long to be among them again, why he hid himself away in his own little world. He knew all too well how it started. He couldn't bear being in the castle or seeing their faces. It all reminded him of Rose, how much he missed her, and he hated seeing his own pain reflected in their grief-stricken faces. But it had been nearly 8 years now. Surely that was time enough. If not for his own sake, then for Gaston's. It was time to be among his friends again. "You're too sweet, Mrs. Potts. I just hope Gaston isn't getting any ideas." "Gaston is full of ideas, Grosvenor, and they are usually brilliant," she said, looking perplexed. "No, that's not what I mean, Mrs. Potts. I was referring to ideas about his station. He spends all his time with the prince, and now dinner with the inside staff. I just don't know." "Stuff and nonsense. You're the king's huntsman. You arrange the royal hunts. You're the head of the outside staff. That means something." "There's no reason you shouldn't eat with us," said Mrs. Potts. You're the Mr. Cogsworth of the outdoor staff, Grosvenor. Your senior staff," Mr. Potts added, then cringed as he seemed to regret comparing him to Mr. Cogsworth. "Well, you know what I mean, anyway." "Still, Mr. Cogsworth won't like it," said Grosvenor. "It doesn't matter what he likes. You know Mr. Cogsworth. He'll never catch up with the times," said Mrs. Potts. "Speaking of which, "Isn't it time to serve dinner?" said Mr. Cogsworth from the servants' hall doorway, where he had been standing quietly listening to the conversation without their notice. At once, everyone at the table stood up at attention, as the custom when he came into the room. "Good evening, Mr. Cogsworth," said Grosvenor, waiting with everyone else for the major domo to take his seat before he sat down again. Everyone looked nervous, waiting to see if Mr. Cogsworth had heard Mrs. Potts and how he might react. But he just sat in silent disapproval. The fact was, Grosvenor had every right to be there, even if it wasn't customary for the outside staff to join the inside staff at meals. There had been reason for him to join when Rose was alive, as she was the senior member of staff, but there was nothing Mr. Cogsworth could do about it then, and very little he could do about it now Mrs. Potts had issued an official invitation. As far as she and most of the other staff were concerned, Grosvenor was family, and they were happy to have him back again. "Yes, well, now that Mr. Cogsworth had joined us, we can start dinner. Lumiere, would you do the honors?" asked Mrs. Potts. Lumiere, taking Mrs. Potts' cue, went off into the kitchen. A few moments later, a legion of kitchen maids in smart black and white uniforms came into the servants' hall carrying delicious and magnificent food in massive serving dishes. Chef Bouge, at the instruction of Mrs. Potts, had provided a splendid meal for the servants that night, and Lumiere, as if he was presenting the meal upstairs for the royal family, announced all the dishes as they came out of the kitchen. The aroma of their feast filled the room from the moment the maids set the dishes on the table. There wasn't usually so much fanfare during the servants' dinner, but everyone was pleased to have Gaston and his father join them that evening. They had decided among them to make it a special occasion. At the center of the table was a large tureen filled with boeuf bourguignon, and next to it were a lovely duck pâté and crouton, a miraculous-looking chicken confit. If I'm mispronouncing it, please correct me, please. A large bowl of potatoes with salted pork, onions, mushrooms, and cheese, an enormous colorful ratatouille, freshly baked bread, savory cheese pastry puffs, and of course, heaps of chocolate mousse with a rich whipped cream for dessert. Gaston and his father were seated near Mr. and Mrs. Potts, at the other end of the table from Mr. Cogsworth. Aside from the glowering majordomo, they were a merry party, composed of the senior members of staff, Lumiere, the Casson Maître, Plumet, the head housemaid, and Chef Bouge. "It's so wonderful to have you here, Monsieur Grosvenor. It has been far too long since we have had your delightful company. We, of course, hear of your adventures from young Gaston, but it is so nice to see you looking so well, and among us here tonight. Isn't that so, Mr. Cogsworth?" said Lumiere, taking delight, as he always did, in making Mr. Cogsworth grumble. "Well, I think it's magnificent," said Plumet, putting her hand on Lumiere's. "It's been far too long since you've eaten with us. Of course, we understand why you stayed away. No need to go into all that," said Mr. Cogsworth, clearing his throat and tugging at the lapels of his coat with a violent twitch. Lumiere gave Mr. Cogsworth the side eye as he stood up and theatrically clapped his hands 3 times to summon the footmen who were standing by. "And now, for a finishing touch to our scrumptious feast Chef Bouge was so expertly prepared for us. I picked something special. Oh, it's splendid. A simply divine libation to celebrate the return of Monsieur Grosvenor. I can say without any hesitation whatsoever, we will all enjoy it immensely," said Lumiere, as the footmen came into the servants' hall with lovely sparkling glasses on silver trays. "As we won't be bothering you or the maids again, please do sit down to your dinner," said Mrs. Potts, excusing the footman so they could join the maids and other staff for their own dinner. "This is a treat," said Mrs. Potts, picking up her glass and examining it. "This looks lovely, Lumiere. Thank you." "Yes, Lumiere, thank you," said Chef Bouge. "Shall we make a toast? Will you mind if I do the honors, Mr. Cogsworth?" asked Mr. Potts, putting his arm around Grosvenor. As you wish. Mr. Cogsworth's expression made him look as if there was a foul smell in the air. What is wrong, Mr. Cogsworth? Does the aroma of dinner offend your senses somehow? Asked Chef Bouge, looking around, agitated. Everyone at the table looked surprised at his directness. Have I somehow gone afoul with the execution of this evening's meal? Does it not meet with your exacting approval? Chef Bouge, who was known for his bad temper, was now out of his seat, red-faced and scowling from under his large blonde moustache. There weren't many people Mr. Cogsworth found intimidating, but it was well known he always did his best to keep Chef Bouge in good spirits if he could help it, else the chef would explode into a fiery rage. Not at all, Chef Bouge. If anything, I am just eager to partake of your divine masterpiece before it becomes a midnight feast, said Mr. Cogsworth. This seemed to calm the chef, to everyone's relief, especially Mr. Cogsworth. Mr. Potts, if you will, said Mr. Cogsworth, giving Mr. Potts the cue to make his toast. Tiens, mon ami, said Mr. Potts, raising his glass to Grosvenor, to our dear friend, returned to us at last. May this be the first of many more nights to come. Cheers. Monsieur Grosvenor, said Lumiere, raising his glass along with the others at the table, all of them looking at Gaston's father. And to Rose, said Mrs. Potts, much loved and never forgotten. And to Gaston, my dear brother, said a voice they did not expect. When everyone turned, they saw the prince standing in the doorway, still in his finery he wore earlier that evening to dine with his parents. At once everyone at the table stood, taking their cue from Mr. Cogsworth, who bolted up from his seat to stand at attention. Is there something we could do for you, your highness? Why didn't you ring? Mr. Cogsworth looked even more uncomfortable than before. It was one thing having Gaston and his father to dinner, but now the prince? It was unheard of, or at least it should have been. Everyone knew this was the sort of thing Mr. Cogsworth would have no truck with. In his mind, it was a slippery slope leading them all into chaos and a disintegration of order, tradition, and propriety. But there was little the man could do if the prince insisted, which seemed very likely. I hoped you'd let me join you for dinner, the prince said, smiling slyly at Gaston. Here, said Gaston, pulling one of the chairs over so the prince could sit next to him. Everyone in the room seemed perfectly happy to have the prince join them except for Mr. Cogsworth. He was a man who liked order and rules, and letting the prince dine with them felt like a grumbling of everything he believed in, a shifting of the ground beneath him in a way that made him wonder how long it would be before everything just fell into mayhem. Of course you can join us for dinner, dear. Sit down, sit down. Chef Bouge had made more than enough, said Mrs. Potts, who was clearly ignoring Mr. Cogsworth's discomfort. This is highly irregular, your highness. Are you sure the king and queen will approve? Won't they wonder where you are? Mr. Cogsworth twitched and fiddled with his waistcoat, a habit that betrayed when he was feeling nervous. They went to bed shortly after dinner, said the prince. And shouldn't you have done the same, young sir? I know Mr. Willowstick is expecting you in the schoolroom first thing tomorrow, said Mr. Cogsworth. You're mistaken, Mr. Cogsworth. He is away visiting his brother for another week yet, the prince smirked, knowing he was winning this match. Mr. Cogsworth's expression seemed to wind even tighter, and it looked as though the prince was enjoying it. I'm sorry, your highness, but it seems he's decided to cut his trip short. He arrived earlier this evening, Mr. Cogsworth said, tugging at his waistcoat again. So where is he, then? The prince made a show of looking around the room. Why isn't he joining the staff for dinner? He made an early night of it since he had such a long journey back, your highness. Cogsworth appeared even twitchier than usual. Everyone held their breath, wondering how this would end. They all knew the prince wasn't the sort of aristocrat who hid behind a thick veil of convention. When he was angry, he let you know, and they had all been on the receiving end of such wrath. I am not doing lessons tomorrow. Do you hear me? This isn't fair. Why did no one tell me he was back before now? The prince did nothing to hide his anger. It was a relief Mr. Willowstick hadn't joined them for dinner, or the prince's wrath would have been directed at him. And if the raised voices that were often heard from the schoolroom were any indication, poor Mr. Willowstick had been on the receiving end of the prince's anger rather frequently. Come on, Kingsley, it's fine. I have lessons with my papa tomorrow anyway. I'll come find you when they're over, Gaston said, pulling out the chair for his friend to sit down, and added, think of all the stories you'll have for me tomorrow after your lessons. Want to make a bet now how many times you'll fall asleep while Mr. Willowstick's rattles on? This made the prince laugh and seemed to bring him out of his sour mood, to everyone's relief, including Gaston's. But that's all it would usually take making him laugh, and Gaston was rather good at it. Kingsley? What's this now? Why are you calling him that? Asked Mr. Cogsworth, looking at Gaston and then the prince with a befuddled expression on his face. It's nothing, Cogsworth. Never mind. Now what are we having for dinner? The prince sat down next to Gaston, giving him a cheeky smile that made Gaston laugh. Aside from Mr. Cogsworth, no one seemed to mind the prince joining them for dinner. In fact, they seemed pleased Gaston had a friend his own age to visit with while the adults chatted. Mr. and Mrs. Potts' younger children were already off to their beds, and though Lumiere and Plumet, Mr. Potts and Mrs. Potts, and even on occasion Chef Bouge enjoyed Gaston's company, it was a good opportunity for them to catch up with Grosvenor while the boys occupied themselves. It was a fun evening for everyone, and when it ended, there were promises to do it again, and many hugs were exchanged before Grosvenor and Gaston made their way into the night back to their cottage. This time, they talked as they walked, marveling at starlit sky sparkling above them. It was a perfect evening, at least Gaston thought so. What was that name you called the prince? Kingsley, was it? His father asked as they passed one of Gaston's favorite oaks on their way home. It's just a nickname, said Gaston, regretting he had used their secret name in front of everyone. He hadn't intended to make that little slip, but he could tell his friend didn't seem to mind. Nevertheless, Gaston didn't feel like explaining it to his papa or anyone else. They wouldn't understand. I heard you two talking during dinner. Did I hear the prince say you beat him at archery the other day? Gaston thought this would make his father proud, but it seemed to only cause him concern. I did beat him. Why? What's it matter? You should have seen it, Papa. I hit the bull's eye every time. The prince didn't even hit the target half the time, said Gaston, laughing. You don't always have to be the best, Gaston, his father said, surprising him. But you're the best, Papa. You're the best at everything. Not when I'm in the company of the king, I'm not. Then he is the best, his father said, rather more serious than Gaston had ever seen him. You mean you let the king think he's the best? Gaston scoffed. Kingsley would never fall for that. Indeed I do. And you should do the same with the prince. But the king has to know, Papa. He must know. Doesn't that make him look foolish pretending while everyone knows you're the best? Kingsley would be cross if I did that, said Gaston, stomping so he could look his father in the eye. He might be cross with you now if you always let him win, but I doubt that will be the case when he's older. Kings always want to be the best, and it's our job to make sure they think they are. He put his hand on Gaston's shoulder and gave him another serious look. You sound like stuffy old Mr. Cogsworth, Gaston said with a laugh. Goodness forbid, said Gaston, his father, his tone softening into a laugh as well. His father seemed content to drop the subject as they continued walking. The sky was an inky black, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. The moon and stars glowed brightly, winking at them as they walked through the forest on their way home. Does the prince often lose his temper like that? His father asked casually, stopping in front of the little cemetery where Gaston's mother was laid to rest. Gaston could tell his father was concerned even though he was pretending not to be. That's how his father was, always calm, never wanting to make a big thing out of anything. Even if Gaston could see his father was clearly vexed. Like what? Gaston knew what his father meant, but he didn't want to let on that his friend lost his temper easily. He didn't want his father to worry. He was already troubled by Gaston's friendship with the prince. He didn't want to give him any more reason to fret, or worse, tell him they shouldn't spend so much time together. He seemed very upset when Mr. Cogsworth told him Mr. Willowstick was back early from his trip. His father bent down to pick some wildflowers that grew along the stone wall surrounding the little cemetery. Gaston had always wondered where he picked the flowers he often brought home from his walks to put on his bedside table, but he should have guessed. "Oh, don't worry about it, Papa. He was just upset because he had plans tomorrow, and it made him all, kingly," said Gaston, laughing. "Ah, that's why the nickname," said his father, bundling the flowers and standing back up. "And he doesn't mind your letting him know when he's acting that way?" "No. He's made me promise not to let him become one of those horrid kings you hear about, chopping off heads and stuff like that." "I believe you're thinking of the Queen of Hearts, but I understand what you mean," his father said, chuckling. "Who is she? She doesn't live in the many kingdoms, does she?" "No, she rules in another world called Wonderland, if the legends are to be believed. You might be able to find a tale or two about her in one of your books," said his father, looking like he was lost in his thoughts while gazing at the wildflowers he had gathered. "What is it, Papa? You seem worried." "I suppose I am, son. I'm just starting to wonder if it's a good thing for you and the prince to be such good friends. You sound like Mr. Cogsworth again." "You'd better stop saying that, or I will have to grow a long, pointy mustache and start twitching at you," said his father, laughing again. "Papa, do you ever think you will tell me how Mama died?" asked Gaston, looking at his mother's tomb. It was the largest in the graveyard, and the prettiest. The queen had one of the most famous and talented sculptors in the land carve a statue of his mother Rose from light pink marble. It stood graceful and serene, as if beckoning Gaston to come inside. Gaston had always found it frightening, as if his dead mother was trying to take him to the other side to be with her. Now that he was older, he wondered if that wasn't the sculpture's purpose. Not to frighten Gaston, of course, but to look as if she was waiting for her family and friends to join her when they were ready to pass into the next realm. He wasn't sure if his theory was right, and he didn't have the courage to ask the queen or his father, so it remained a mystery. "Oh, son," his father looked tired suddenly. "It's not a story for young ears." He started down the path again, signaling that Gaston should do the same. "Perhaps when I'm older, then?" asked Gaston, running to catch up with his father. "Perhaps, my boy. We shall see." Once Gaston and his father got back into their cottage and tucked snugly in their beds, Gaston ran over the day and the evening's events in his mind. It was probably one of the best nights he'd had, and he hoped there would be many more nights like that to come.